Jumbo, welcome.
Jumbo, welcome.
This is Operation Power, a voice for Black radical
Mhm.
politics and revolutionary change. This is a program that comes to you each Thursday at 7 p.m. on Black Power Media Reloaded. And we're so glad to have been a part of this program. And we've got an exciting topic for you
Yes, we
today.
do.
The UN votes to make transatlantic slave trade, we say slave trade, the gravest, Gravest,
Gravest.
the gravest crime against humanity. So we're going to look at that topic. We're going to have an examination of what that means for us here in New York, in the United States, as well as across the world. And we've got a great special guest, Dr. Gerald Horne, who will be, Professor Dr. Gerald Horne, who will be joining us shortly. But first, just want to let you know, my name is Inez Barron, and I am the co-host along with my husband, the bold, the outspoken, the indomitable, the one, the only, the unbought, the unbossed.
The humble servant, Charles Barron. And it's always an honor to be on with the love of my life, my wife of 43 years, the stunningly beautiful,
Thank you.
the intellectually brilliant Inez Barron.
Thank you so much. Well, we as a people know that we are in a position brought to us, or we've gotten here because our ancestors made great sacrifices, made great strides, had great things that they were doing, fighting against the oppression that we continue to suffer from. So we do want to take time to have a libation where we acknowledge our ancestors and the sacrifices that they have made, many of them whose names we don't know and may never know. But we do have a video that offers a libation to our ancestors.
Nothing important happens without a libation. And so for this very important presentation, we begin by the pouring of libation. We pour libation first to our first ancestor, to that hidden one who, though hidden, manifests in all things as all things, that God-goddess idea in the universe by any and all names. To our first ancestor, we pour libation, Ashe. We pour libation too to our ancestors because they were the first people on this planet, mothers and fathers of all mankind, flashpoint of the human family. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to our ancestors because they were the ones who first gave birth to the idea of civilization, knew we would need a form of governance, and they nurtured that idea along the Nile until it reached its zenith in Kemet. There they built these gigantic monuments as evidence of that great civilization, and they carved instructions on the walls of temples and tombs for us, so we would never forget. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to our ancestors because over time they put together all the tenets of civilization and they took those ideas and left the continent. They were the people of the first Exodus. They left Africa and went all over the world and peopled the world. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. We pour libation too to our ancestors because they did not sit on their laurels. They continued to improve, continued to evolve, and at each point of evolution, they again would leave the continent and settle and resettle the planet. They met themselves coming and going. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to those ancestors because over time, they found themselves the object of a forced exodus when they were kidnapped, shackled, cargoed, shipped out of Africa and enslaved in diasporas around the world. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to the ancestors left at home, the very young, the aged, the infirm, left to reinvent themselves, depleted of us, human resources. But they were enjoined by us in the diasporas, both objects of a global myopia that ruptured the soul of a people as it ravaged a continent. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to those ancestors because over time they began to remember who and what they were. Because no matter where they had been dropped off, they still retained bits and pieces of who and what they were. They retained that African core that described them. They began to remember bits and pieces of a song. They began to remember lines from a rhythm. They began to remember dances that they did in ancient times. They began to remember those ancient drum beats that they now beat out on bare skin. And so to those ancestors, we pour libation. I shave. Pour libation too to them, because they then began to teach each other. They began to resurrect and reconstruct that history and that culture. They became the new Africans wherever they were. They became the new teachers, preachers, archaeologists, the new singers, dancers, the new drummers, the new Jaliyah. They reconstructed that history and our culture and became new Africans everywhere. So to those ancestors, we pour libation. I shave. Pour libation to those ancestors, because they are the ones who pass that information on to us. And so we pour libation to those of you who will watch this presentation, those of you who are the recipients of that pieced together history, of that reconstructed culture. To you, we pour libation. I shave. Pour libation to our children and those yet to be born, for they are the ones that you must teach. And you can only teach if you know the history. So to you who are learning the history and are passing on that history, and to our children who are learning that history and will pass that history on to all eternity, but they will call your name in all eternity. To our children, we pour libation. Ashe.
Oh, thank you so much to our engineer, Brother Kiru Gichiru. Thank you so much. And now we want to move on to a very brief video we want to share with you. It's a video which talks about, in a very nutshell, what Operation Power, how it got started, and some of its accomplishments. So it's a brief video about Operation Power. We'll share that with you, and then we'll move further in our program.
Operation Power stands for people organizing and working for empowerment and respect.
Operation Power is a grassroots social justice organization founded by local community stakeholders, which includes activists, organizers, and leaders who understand that the system as it is currently structured is destroying us and our communities.
The system, the capitalist system, one that promotes human greed over human need, one that promotes profit over people, needs to be dismantled. These local community organizers recognize capitalism needs to be destroyed and replaced with socialism.
Operation Power was founded in 1997 with the understanding that uprooting capitalism needs to begin locally. Operation Power understood that our communities are the perfect vehicle to dismantle this parasitic capitalist system brick by brick, and the economic, political, and cultural institutions and other systems in place in our local community infrastructure. Whether it's the local school board, community board, city council, state assembly, all represents mechanisms to control the destiny of our people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we do have some books that we want to call to your attention. And they're books that are personally related to the organization. And the first one is written by none other than Charles Barron, and it is entitled Speaking Truth to Power. And is a compilation of articles and essays that have been written over the years. The second one is an analysis of capitalism. It's called It's Not You, It's Capitalism, Why It's Time to Break Up and How to Move On. And the author is Malika Jabali. We encourage you to get that. And the next few are a trilogy, and they're novels. First one is called Black Rising. It's a page turner. Once you start it, you won't put it down until you finish. And the second in the series is called Black Rising Home and Abroad. And the third in the trilogy is called The Threat. All of these books are available online at Barnes & Noble, and we do encourage you to go and check out those books. You will be greatly enlightened. Well, we're here. We're ready for our program. We're going to have an exciting talk, and I just want to give a brief bio of our special guest, Dr. Gerald Horn. He is a historian, a professor, a prolific writer of more than 40 in-depth books with great references and footnotes. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and he holds degrees from Princeton, Columbia, and the University of California at Berkeley. He holds the John and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's a contributing editor of Political Affairs magazine and the author of more than 40 books and hundreds of scholarly articles and reviews. And his latest book is The Counter-Revolution of 1893, The Hawaiian Coup and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism in the Asia-Pacific Basin. And so we just want to welcome you, Dr. Horn. We're so glad and honored that you are our special guest today. There you are.
Thank you, Dr. Horn. We are so excited about today. And we've been saying for a long time, and we think we need to adapt this nationally, internationally. No taxation without reparation. There are other people that said no taxation without representation. When the American so-called revolution was really a rebellion against England, they said if we're not represented there, then we will have no taxation. So no taxation without reparations. And as we speak of reparations, we understand that reparations without revolution will keep us on the American plantation, but with a little more resources. So we got to continue also to fight for radical, systemic, revolutionary change. Right before Dr. Horn comes on, we want to hear from the president of Ghana, John Mahama, who made the presentation at the UN. We have a short speech that he made at the UN, calling this the gravest, and that's the key word there, the gravest of all crimes against humanity was that. And so we'll hear from that, and then we'll get Dr. Horn right back on. This is the president of Ghana.
Secretary General of the UN, Excellencies, permanent representatives, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Progress is made in little steps. It is the forward motion towards something better, and changes often come incrementally. Today marks the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. It is a day on which we honor the memory of the approximately 13 million African men, women, and children who were enslaved over the course of several centuries. We remember them through articles, oral histories, through broadcast programs, books, music, visits to museums, monuments, and memorials such as the Ark of Return, located right here at the Visitors Plaza of the United Nations headquarters. Through these activities, we do more than remember. We document and educate, we gain greater perspective, we find the delicate balance of learning from history so that we do not repeat it while leaving our pain behind. In doing so, we begin to heal individually within our immediate communities and also within the global community. This day of remembrance did not happen by accident. In 2006, our global community gathered here, just as we have done today, and resolved to designate the 25th of March of the following year a day of remembrance. It marked significant progress. Then the following year, in 2007, we decided to make the event an annual one so that the 25th March of every year would be the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. That marked an additional step in our forward motion. And so it's indeed for teachers to be here today, 2 decades later, addressing the General Assembly on behalf of the African Group regarding the draft resolution entitled declaration of the trafficking of enslaved Africans, and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. In September last year, at the 80th session of the General Assembly, I stood in this exact place and served notice that Ghana will move a motion to declare the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity. This current draft resolution is a result of months of consultation and consensus building by continental bodies, nations, experts, scholars, and jurists, with the sole aim of achieving a united front and grounding the final outcome in truth, compassion, and moral conscience, remembrance, education, and dialogue. So today we come together in solemn solidarity to affirm truth and pursue a route to healing and reparative justice. The adoption of this resolution serves as a safeguard against forgetting. It also challenges the enduring scars of slavery. Madam President, let me conclude with two significant quotes by two great leaders of history, one of them white and one of them black. The former President of the United States of America, Theodore Roosevelt, said, and I quote, "With a great moral issue involved, neutrality does not serve righteousness. For to be neutral between right and wrong is to serve wrong." Again, civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King also reminds us, and I quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." We've traveled this long road, each step guided by a desire to be better and to do better. Each step bringing us closer to the kind of world we would want to leave for our children. And so, delegates, on this beautiful day in March, we're called to stand on the right side of history. Let it be recorded that when history beckoned, we did what was right for the memory of the millions who suffered the indignity of the slave trade and those who continue to suffer racial discrimination. Let our vote on this resolution restore their dignity and humanity.
There you have it. That was the president of Ghana, speaking to the world on this question of reparation and the transatlantic slave raid. We call it the slave raid because we want to clear up some contradictions. Yeah, there were some African chiefs who sold us into slavery, but the massive amount of transatlantic slave trade and the Arab slave trade that people don't talk about was a raid, not a trade. So we just wanted to make that very, very clear. When the vote proceeded, 123 countries voted yes, 3 countries voted no, America, Israel, and Argentina, and 52 countries abstained, especially those European countries who enslaved us, like England and France. They're the ones who actually enslaved us and know that they may be paying reparations, so they abstain. Dr. Horn, so what do you think of this? What does this mean for African people all over the world?
It's very significant. It's very profound. First of all, we should congratulate the government and people of Ghana, particularly President Mahama. I don't think it's accidental or coincidental that Ghana, West Africa, has one of the largest populations, expatriate populations of Black Americans, which stretches back to independence in 1957. I think we also should realize that the President Mahama has put the ball in our court. And I would say particularly the ball in the court of Black New York. You mentioned that Israel, the United States, and Argentina voted against this worthwhile resolution. Obviously, it's incumbent upon Black New York to begin to picket the United Nations mission of the United States of America, of Israel and Argentina. With regard to the latter two in particular, we should make sure that the press of their countries are aware of this picket, because it's likely to then put pressure on those particular regimes. And I should also say that in terms of next steps in this righteous struggle for reparations, we should recognize that this is going to have to be an international effort. And we should be organizing to send delegations to Havana, because I'm sure that our Cuban friends would be interested in helping us to put pressure on Argentina, Israel, and the United States of America. After the bombs stop falling in Iran, we should also be sending delegations there as well. And I would also say that we should consider delegations to Russia and China, who voted in favor of this resolution. Obviously have a bone to pick with the United States government. I'm sure that both Beijing and Moscow would argue that if US tax dollars are going towards reparations, they won't be going towards nuclear weapons to attack Russia and China in particular. So I think that we've reached a fork in the road. I would also like to congratulate the Caribbean nations and the other African Union nations for joining in this 123 nation majority. They are under pressure. We know this because Jamaica and Antigua in particular have been pressured to withdraw of the health care of their own citizenry. So there are many bouquets to pass around, but there's much more work to be done.
That's right. Much more work to be done. Speaking of that, we often talk about the transatlantic slave raid, as we call it, and what amount of destruction of African humanity it really occurred. Because even in the Congo with King Leopold and all of the deaths, millions in the Congo, millions during the Middle Passage, the Ma'afa, the ride over, thousands when they went inland to get us, and then millions more died once we got on the plantation and came here. So speak a little more about the atrocities. They're incredible.
Well, you may know that I was interviewed by Deutsche Welle, the German broadcaster, and you can find that interview on my Facebook page. And one of the questions that was posed to me was taken directly from the mouth of the United Nations representative, who said during the debate that what about murder, rape, and torture with regard to the gravest injustices? And of course, my response was that murder, rape, and torture were an essential element of the unlimited African slave trade.
That's right.
We should not only focus on that, but we should also focus upon another facet that's oftentimes lost sight of. That is to say that the enslavers oftentimes would try to single out for capture and kidnapping agriculturalists. That's one of the reasons why you have had in South Carolina in particular a rice trade, for example, because they kidnapped Africans from West Africa who knew about growing rice and then brought them here to the United States of America. They kidnapped folks who had knowledge with regard to blacksmithing, with regard to architecture. I've analogized it to if in the 21st century, the People's Republic of China went along the Pacific coast and kidnapped computer programmers and software developers, et cetera, and brought them back to China. This is the essence of the outrage of the unlimited African slave trade.
Incredible. You know, right in New York City, we had a bill that we presented to the New York State Assembly. They watered it down and changed it. Instead of having community groups select the commission, like the December 12th movement, like the Institute of the Black World, like in Cobra, they gave that after Inez and I left, they changed it to say that the governor will pick 3 and the head of the assembly will pick 3 and the head of the Senate will pick 3. So they watered it down and never got anything done. But New York City in particular was the second largest slave-holding city in the nation, only second to South Carolina, Charlotte.
Well, there was also a very intimate and close relationship between the financing of the African slave trade and the transport of Africans into Dixie. That is to say that on Wall Street in particular, you had firms who were involved in financing these slave raids, to use your term, just like we know that it was not only New York City that was an entrepot for bringing Africans across the Atlantic, but Rhode Island, believe it or not, was a very important cog in this evil machine. And once we accomplish our goals and objectives in New York City and in New York State, we should add to the effort in Rhode Island in particular, which has had an ongoing movement with regard to reparations for the African slave trade and for their ignominious role in financing these slave raids.
Now, you know, it's interesting when people talk about reparations and trying to compute how much is owed. I appreciate Omali Yeshitela and the African People's Socialist Party in 1982. They had an international hearing on the question of reparations right in Brooklyn, New York. And they came up with a figure about 4 trillion plus is owed. But you know, what's interesting, and I find that our people have a way of sometimes saying, that was in the past. This is now. And then you have white people saying, we had nothing to do with that. We didn't enslave you. Why should we have to pay when we had nothing to do with that? So how would you answer the question to those people who say that? And then to some people that will say, like Barack Obama himself, when he was president, he said he wasn't supporting reparations. He was supporting economic development. How some people try to wiggle and talk about economic development in the present day budgets when they're already discriminating against us in these budgets. And that's separate struggle from reparations itself, which is a debt owed.
Well, if you are somehow enjoying the bounty of this developed society, speaking of the United States of America, then you are complicit in one way or another with regard to the African slave trade, because we know that enslaved African labor helped to build the bounty that those who are now saying they have nothing to do with slavery, well, they're enjoying the bounty by living in this society. I should also bring up the hypocrisy of certain nations with regard to this measure brought at the United Nations just a few days ago. We know that Israel received reparations from the Federal Republic of Germany because of the Holocaust, which concluded in 1945. Israel didn't become a state until 1947, 1948. Yet I don't see the supporters of Israel arguing that perhaps Berlin should not have paid reparations to Israel, since Israel wasn't in existence during the course of the Holocaust. Even Argentina, for example, you may know that Argentina was a recipient of enslaved Africans. Historians have pointed out that some of the major cultural traditions of Argentina, for example, the national dance known as the tango, have their roots in West Central Africa, for example. You may also ask, well, what happened to the Black population of Argentina? And this is a lesson for us all, particularly in light of this disastrous escapade in Iran. What happened in Argentina is that to a certain extent, a number of the Africans were killed off in unjust wars against Argentina's neighbors, for example, which now allows Argentina to masquerade as some sort of paragon of whiteness, which is one of the many reasons why there are more psychiatrists per capita in Buenos Aires, the capital, than any other place on planet Earth.
Wow. You know, also people we need to hold Europe accountable. I understand that Europe would not have existed if it wasn't for them pillaging and robbing the resources of Africa. Speak a little bit about, particularly in your book, in the Counter-Revolutionary Conspiracy in 1776, how the enslaved Africans built the fundamental basic foundation for the capitalist economy and for Europe during its years of feudalism and eventually capitalism.
Well, take the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688. What was at issue there was that the Royal African Company, under the administration of the monarch, was dominating the trade in enslaved Africans. The merchant class wanted a piece of the action, and so they clipped the wings of the monarch, leaving us with King Charles III today, who was one of the wealthiest men on planet Earth, not least because of his family's and ancestors' role in the African slave trade, but certainly does not wield as much political power in 2026 as his ancestors wielded, for example, before 1688. And we should also point out with regard to 1776, which established this so-called republic in North America, historians have begun to grapple with the reality that what was at issue there was not only overturning London's edict, which was seeking to restrain the settlers led by that mass landowner, George Washington, from moving westward across the continent at London's expense, making war against indigenous populations. And then after the land is taken, dragging Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic. This fortunately has been captured in a number of films that I would recommend. First of all, Belle, B-E-L-L-E, directed by the famed Ghanaian British director Ama Asante, and starring the great British South African actor Gugu Mbatha Roy. And I would also recommend The Book of Negroes, which is a Canadian BET, believe it or not, and South African production, which has a classic of Black cinema, where our heroine confronts George Washington in Lower Manhattan after his so-called victory, and she's wondering when there will be a victory for Africans. And so, once again, our artists and our historians are beginning to tell a new story. Unfortunately, that new story has not penetrated the thick skulls of many of our legislators and policymakers in Washington, D.C.
Dr. Horn, you spoke of Germany having to pay reparations to a country that didn't even exist at the time that these crimes were committed. Give us some information about how it is that when Haiti achieved its freedom, it had to pay France. How does that happen? And what was the underpinning for that?
Well, first of all, a footnote with regard to Germany. You may also recall that they were not necessarily direct participants in the African slave trade, but they were a notorious participant in the colonizing of Africa, particularly Namibia, today's Namibia. The first genocide of the 20th century took place in Southwest Africa, Namibia, as it is now known, against the Nama and Herero people. And despite its generosity towards Israel, Berlin has steadfastly refused to pay reparations in any meaningful manner to the government and people of Namibia. And so you should add to that list of United Nations missions to be picketed the United Nations mission of the Federal Republic of Germany as well. With regard to France, recall that after the triumph of the Haitian Revolution, that glorious effort, that transformational revolution, unlike 1776, for example, culminating in independence, the first Black Republic in 1804, Haitian revolutionaries, like revolutionaries everywhere, began to spread their gospel of anti-slavery and therefore helped to inspire slave revolts here in North America, throughout the Caribbean, Barbados, Grenada, St. Vincent, even Venezuela, for example. But alas, what happens is that the French were not willing to accept this transformation. And so they sent gunboats to Haiti and basically extracted from the barrel of a gun pledges and promises for the Haitian regime to pay reparations to the former enslavers, for example. And you can draw a straight line from that gunboat action of France in the 1820s in particular to the continuing difficulties of Haiti as we speak. I should also point out that when Britain was forced to abolish slavery in the 1830s in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, etc., once again, there were not reparations paid to the enslaved, but Britain, as late as the 21st century, was still paying off the enslavers and their descendants. So you cannot separate the wealth of certain British families, as activists have repeatedly pointed out. You cannot separate their wealth from the fact that they were taking money from the coffers in London. So there are a lot of apologies that need to be made, but more than apologies, we need action. We need reparations now.
That's right. You know, it's interesting you mentioned Berlin. The Berlin Conference in 1884-85 is when they literally carved up all of Africa and split it between the European countries. It had happened in Berlin, and they had a lot to do with promoting that. I'll talk a little bit about, in 1988, I think it was, when Ronald Reagan paid reparations to the those who were interned during 1942. The Japanese, they got paid reparations. Why not the Africans?
Well, I think that there is a lesson to be gleaned from that particular episode. That is to say, that the Japanese Americans who were interned unconstitutionally between 1942 and 1945 had their property seized, by the way, before the internment of Japanese Americans along the Pacific coast. They had substantial wealth with regard to agriculture in particular. The United States also put pressure on other countries as far south as Peru to intern folks of Japanese ancestry in South America. You may recall that a former president of Peru, Alberto Fujimori, was actually of Japanese ancestry. And of course, his daughter is now a leading politician in Peru as we speak. But what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the Japanese along the Pacific coast, from not only California heading south to South America, but also from Canada, British Columbia, for example. They had a powerful government, an influential government in Tokyo that was backing their demands, which brings me back to a salute to the African Union, to CARICOM, to President Mahama, and also to our friends in the Black New York community, who we fully expect to pick up the baton and pressure these recalcitrant regimes, such as Israel, the United States, and Argentina, and then moving on to those who were too spineless to vote and decided to abstain. I'm speaking of the Federal Republic of Germany, of France, Spain, Portugal, and needless to say, London.
Incredible. The reparations movement is picking up steam. However, it also runs the danger of being co-opted. That there's a difference between reparations, a debt owed for the enslavement of centuries of African people, than from what we're supposed to get out of the budgets for as tax-paying citizens. So if we're paying tax and you're not giving us proper education or proper housing or proper jobs or whatever, that's one battle. That's not reparations.
Right.
If we call for something in New York City and we call for reparations and you say, here's a $10 million for scholarships. No, that's because you discriminated against us with our taxpaying dollars. So talk about making that distinction between reparations as a debt owed and discrimination.
Well, certainly you have a very, very valid point. I mean, with regard to $10 million in scholarships, in a certain sense, That's not reparations. That's not a gift, because obviously they want to train these fertile and brilliant young minds so that they become cogs in the capitalist machine and therefore help to create profits for our.
Yeah. I think we're frozen.
Demanding. We should obviously depend upon our policymakers and our legislators. We should be asking, for example, what is the position of Congressman Gregory Meeks of Southeast Queens with regard to these efforts? What is the position of Congressman Hakeem Jeffries with regard to these initiatives? What is the position of Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez with regard to these initiatives? What is the position of the newly elected mayor of New York, Mayor Mamdani, with regard to these initiatives? All of these politicians need to be on the record, but more than on the record, need to put their shoulder to the wheel to make sure the justice is consummated.
Well, you know, some people, and we got to make sure that when we talk about reparations, we're talking about all African people. We are an African people. Some people said, no, I'm American. Well, when you were brought here, there was no America. There were 13 colonies. America didn't even exist. And as Dr. Clark said, we are not who we are based upon where the boats dropped us off, but it's where they picked us up from. So they picked us all up from Africa. Dropped some in Jamaica, dropped some in North America, South America, Central America, and Brazil, and other places. You don't become the nationality or the place where you dropped off. We all started as Africans. And even here in America, there were some people say Africans were here with the indigenous people, and then others were brought here, but there was no America. They made that up after 1776. Dr. Horn?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned 1776, because at that particular moment, there were approximately 500,000 Africans in the 13 colonies. By 1861, there were over 4 million. And this also speaks to the point that, yes, the United States was complicit with regard to it minimally, speaking conservatively, 3.5 million Africans who arrived on these shores after the United States was formed. And this also speaks to the demagogy of the United Nations representative speaking to Mr. Mahama's resolution when he said that there was a certain legality. But there was no legality with regard to that 3.5 million. The United States supposedly abolished this role in the slave trade in 1808, and yet you still have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Africans flowing into this country after 1808, not to mention what I pointed out in my own research, which is that U.S. enslavers were maniacally energetic in terms of dragging enslaved Africans to Cuba, to Brazil. Recall that Texas was an independent country between 1836 and 1845. Texas today has the largest Black population in the United States of America. It's fair to say that these Black people who were brought to Galveston were not brought under the color of law, they were brought under the color of illegality. So we have a strong legal case, strong political case. What we have to do now is three things: organize, organize, organize.
That's right. You know, that's important because a lot of people think the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. But when you actually read the 13th Amendment, it says slavery shall be abolished except as a punishment for crime. It seems as though we went from the plantation to the penitentiary.
Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the documentary by the filmmaker Ava DuVernay, which deals precisely with that point. Not to mention the book written by Michelle and Alexandra, The New Jim Crow, which seeks to draw a straight line from slavery to mass incarceration. But it's not only that. I think we need to recognize a couple of more points as well, which is that when slavery was abolished, supposedly in 1865, unlike in Jamaica, Barbados, for example, where I mentioned that the enslavers were paid a kind of reparations, but the enslavers in Dixie were outraged that their so-called property was taken without compensation, which led directly to Ku Klux Klan, led directly to lynching, led directly to a form of terrorism. And I think, once again, you can draw a straight line from the 1860s to the hell we're still suffering in 2026. That is to say that these folks and those they have influenced have not gotten over the difficult reality that their so-called property was taken without compensation, and they tend to penalize and pulverize us forevermore unless and until we can turn the tables. And I think that this resolution just passed at the United Nations is one step forward towards turning the tables.
You know, and it should build on, I think his name was Eunice Campbell, was his name, in the 1800, right after enslavement, when they actually was able to get the Sea Islands as a part of reparations and was able to really almost start a whole new government. I think we may have lost Dr. Horn. Dr. Horn, you still there?
It's buffering. Maybe you want to talk about
it's buffering. So anyway, but during that time, we were actually given some land. When we was talking about, 30 acres or 40 acres and a mule, they were given some acreage at that time, and they were fighting to get the mules to develop that land on the Sea Islands. And after they did develop the land, and thousands of Africans went to the Sea Islands and lived on that land, and was starting their own government and had their own militia to protect the government that they had started. It wasn't until then, I think Andrew Jackson, his name, Jackson. Andrew Jackson, the racist, came right after Lincoln was assassinated. And by the way, Lincoln did not free any enslaved Africans. Lincoln was a racist. He said, if I can free the enslaved Africans to save the Union, if I could free some, I will. If I don't have to free any, I won't. And what I want to do, and Lerone Bennett's book, Forced into Glory, speaks to it well. He wanted to free, Lincoln, African people and send us back to Africa to keep America white and pure. So the 13th Amendment said that slavery shall be abolished except as a punishment for crime. And Lincoln did not free enslaved Africans in those states that did not leave the Union. He's back. Dr. Horn is back. So the slave states that stayed with the Union, was 4 of them. He said, you can keep your enslaved Africans. And then the other slave states that left with the Confederacy under Jefferson Davis, they said, yours is free. He had no jurisdiction over them. So really, Lincoln didn't free anybody. Dr. Horn?
You're making a solid point. And I should also make a point about Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. And of course, I support the Juneteenth holiday, but there's a certain mythology around Juneteenth, which is supposedly that when the U.S. government troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, they were arriving with the news, supposedly, that the enslaved were free. Now, as you correctly noted, when Mr. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it had no application in Texas. Texas was the largest slave state by territory as a result of seceding from the Union, and ultimately had the largest Black population. When the men in blue arrived in Galveston, they were seeking to forestall enslavers from moving in mass to Mexico, where a French puppet leader, Maximilian, had overthrown the Mexican government, and the plot was to overthrow abolition in Mexico and continue slavery. That was what Juneteenth was all about. But once again, I go into some detail on that episode in my book on Texas slavery. But in any case, that should not detract from our continuing attempts to mark Juneteenth in a meaningful fashion.
You know, you're right, because when we were fighting in Albany, when I was in the state assembly and Inez was in the state assembly, we were pushing Governor Cuomo to do reparations.
Right.
So everybody was pushing for reparations, and he comes up with Juneteenth. Half of us weren't even asking for that. Not that I agree with you. It's a celebrate it. It beats celebrating the 4th of July, or July as they call it. But we weren't fighting for Juneteenth. We were fighting for reparations, and they gave us some holiday. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that put some substance on what we were saying. We got about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to go off topic a little bit, but then it isn't off topic. I'm reading a book of yours on the dying or declining American empire, and how when we're looking at what's going on now, speaking of reparations and all of these important issues, and the rise of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and about 10, 20 other countries now, and the moving away from the IMF and the World Bank and the declining dollar, and looking at currency, the yuan and the ruble of Russia, the yuan of China, and the rupee of India. All of these new things are coming up. I think this is a good time to connect reparations with revolution on the dying American empire.
Well, you are certainly correct to suggest that U.S. imperialism is on the defensive. You saw it last night with that ridiculous speech by Mr. Trump, where he says he's going to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age. Recall that a similar phrase was used with regard to Vietnam some decades ago. Right. We also know how that story ended, with an ignominious exit by U.S. imperialism in April 1975. I dare say that a similar exit will be taking place from Iran sooner rather than later. And we also need to recognize that Mr. Trump accidentally, I trust, although you never know with this guy, he might be getting under the table payments. He's helped to create a new superpower with regard to Iran, because for some time to come, Iran will have a stranglehold in energy exports from the Strait of Hormuz. Recall that George H.W. Bush went to war against Iraq in 1990 because Iraq had seized Kuwait, and Mr. Bush said that that would give Iraq a stranglehold on energy supplies, and therefore that could not stand. Mr. Trump has accomplished a similar objective. And we also need to pay attention to the fact that with regard to ships who are traversing the Strait of Hormuz, supposedly Iran is demanding payment in Chinese currency, which is a step towards de-dollarization, for example. So certainly U.S. imperialism is on the defensive, it's on the back foot, and to coin a phrase, we should hit them while they're down.
Absolutely. You know, I was talking to Inez yesterday about the importance of the currency. You know, I was doing a little research on the rise and fall of the British Empire, and how the pound was the currency. And like after World War II, or I call it Imperialist War II, when Winston Churchill and Roosevelt got together and said, look, England is too damaged from the war. America, you take over. Let the dollar emerge, and we'll back it by gold, the gold they stole from Africa. And so when we see all of this happening, and BRICS rising, as a matter of fact, and the Sahel revolution in West Africa, how they kicked out the French and kicking out America, and the resources are coming to themselves. This is a very interesting time to be alive.
We're living through history. I mean, for example, many commentators have pointed out the echoes of 1956, when once again Israel, this time joined by Britain and France, sought to overthrow the patriotic government of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, with regard to control of the Suez Canal. They had to beat a retreat, and that marked the beginning of the end for the French Empire and the British Empire. Likewise, with regard to settler colonialism on these shores, as I pointed out in my book on the 16th century, you cannot separate the rise of settler colonialism on these shores without understanding how Protestant London, which had expelled this Jewish community at the end of the 13th century, was under the gun wielded by Catholic Spain and Catholic Portugal, and as a result, cut a deal with the Jewish community expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, taking advantage of Jewish diaspora networks, and that marked the rise of Anglo power, the British Empire, which then passed the baton on to the United States post 1945. So Mr. Trump accidentally, and you never know with this guy, as I said, he might be getting bribes under the table, but accidentally it seems that he's unraveling US power. And we are living through a momentous period, a momentous time. And once again, there is no better time than the present to press our just cause for reparations.
That's right. You know, I think your call, and I'm going to go back to the organizers in New York, those are good calls to go to those missions, to go to those United Nations missions of Argentina, of Israel, of America, and really, really put some pressure there. And especially at a time when we see the rise, and I would like to just to close with a few remarks in a minute or two we have left on the Sahel Revolution, the importance of that, and how that's important for African people throughout the diaspora. And brothers and sisters, when we talk about Africa, and it is connected to East New York, it's connected to Brooklyn, it's connected to Harlem, it's connected to our inner cities, because we are an African people, and at some point we're going to have to really connect. Malcolm X said it best when they said, well, why should I talk about Africa? I don't have nothing in Africa. And Malcolm said, yes, you left your mind in Africa. So talk about the importance of making that connection with Africans in America and the Sahel Revolution.
Well, certainly our brothers and sisters in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are carrying the torch on our behalf by battling French colonialism, battling US colonialism. And also, I'm happy to see that you mentioned some of these evildoers who are now under attack on the Persian Gulf, speaking of the United Arab Emirates, which is in bed with Israel and is committing all manner of deviltry in Africa. We mostly focus on the Sudan, understandably, since they've been implicated in genocide there. But with regard to these religious zealots who the Sahel nations are battling, there's reason to believe that they are being financed under the table by these Persian Gulf monarchs. And I'm happy to say that I have a book coming out in a few months that deals with the African slave trade heading east to West Asia, to the Persian Gulf, to Egypt, for example, which was a major power with regard to the African slave trade. Egypt committed all manner of crimes and atrocities in neighboring Sudan, for example. So after we take care of business concerning these North Atlantic nations, we need to next turn our attention to Egypt, to the United Arab Emirates, to Saudi Arabia, etc.
And it's interesting because those are the countries that Iran is hitting right now. So if we think that this is not going to be helpful to us here in America and us African people throughout the diaspora, it's important that we get together with our people in the Caribbean, Africans here in America, in South America, Central America. In America, we are 51.2 million African people in America, 1.4 billion on the continent of Africa, and hundreds of millions more in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, and in Asia. When we come together as an African people and don't let anyone else divide us and have us separated, saying that's their fight, not our fight, and vice versa, we have to be united. Dr. Horn, closing remarks?
Well, thank you for inviting me. I look forward to reading newspaper articles about your successful picketing of the United Nations missions of Israel, Argentina, and the United States of America, and then moving on to Britain, France, Portugal, and Spain, and also moving on to other abstainers like Poland, Bulgaria, etc. You have a lot of work to do, but I am confident that you're up to the task.
Thank you, sir. Inez?
Dr. Horn, as always, you've raised our consciousness, our understanding. You've pricked our ability to try to understand the connection between things that they would want us to think are not connected. We just appreciate you. Charles and I said, well, how does he have time to write yet another book? But we encourage you. We support you in that regard. And our people are elevated and enlightened so much each and every time. We go on YouTube and we look for your videos and we take notes and we study them.
Yes.
So you make us all proud. You're a genius, you're erudite, but yet and still at the same time, you make it very simple. And we appreciate you and thank you for all the work that you do in helping us to raise our consciousness and to take action,
That's
not
right.
just talk, but to take action and do things.
Well, brothers and
raise our
sisters, as
people.
we say
No,
each and every week, we say our struggle may be long, but our victory is certain. And we also say that the truth shall set us free, and power is the great equalizer. Black power.
Black power.